And once you get the schedule pulled up here in a second, you'll see 12, 13 classes to cover the book of Daniel is not a ton. There are only 12 chapters, but some of it's fairly heavy material or complicated or lengthy chapters. And so one of the things that we will encourage you to is, especially in this first section, chapters 1 to 6, with the stories of the book of Daniel, this material is much more familiar to us. And so especially if you can make it a point to read the chapter and look at some of the questions ahead of time, then I think that'll make sure that we don't get behind in this first half of the book. And we're not going to have time to talk about everything in class anyway, but especially if everybody comes to class prepared, having read it, thought about some questions, that will help us cover everything in the amount of time allotted and reserve that last 6 classes or 7 classes or so for the more difficult part of the book, which is chapter 7 to 12. So tonight we're going to talk about Daniel chapter 2, and let's just jump in. So let's read a little bit. We're going to read in chunks here, and the way we'll start is by reading 2 sections. So we're going to break at one point and skip over some verses. But we're going to start in verse 1, read to verse 16. Then we're going to jump to verse 25. I'll alert you to that. But let's just read for a little bit here and get the gist of the story. Remind ourselves again of this fairly familiar account. And then I have a question I'm going to ask you guys to discuss amongst yourselves and share out. Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 1. In the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. Tough boss, right? But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see that the word is firm from me. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. Chaldeans answered the king and said, There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand, for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. Because of this, the king was very angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, Why is the decree of the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. We're going to skip verse 25, read a few more verses here. Verse 25, Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste and said thus to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Are you able to make known to me the dream and I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered the king and said, No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in your bed came thoughts of what will be after this, and he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. Okay, here's the question I have for you. Hopefully that, if you hadn't read it beforehand, jogs your memory of what happens in this chapter. But amongst yourselves, discuss for a couple minutes here, what other Bible story, maybe there's multiple Bible stories, that would be fantastic. What other Bible story do you think of when you read Daniel chapter 2? Go beyond that, not just the connections to another story in the Bible, but why does that matter? What significance does that perhaps add to the reading of Daniel chapter 2? Discuss amongst yourselves for a couple minutes, and then we'll share out. Okay, I'm hearing a hush fall over the crowd. Maybe we're done. At least gone as far as we can go. All right, what story? Primarily, I want to rank answers here. All answers are good. What story came to mind? Dan?
Joseph was made king, and his brothers come before him and everything.
Okay, now what particular part of the Joseph story is most similar to Daniel chapter 2? Okay, yeah, well, dreams, okay? And we remember that Joseph, dreams is a big deal in the Joseph story, okay? In particular, whose dream are we reminded of when we read Daniel chapter 2? Pharaoh's dream, okay? And what did Pharaoh ask? Who can interpret the dream? Okay, who could interpret the dream? Well, yeah, finally Joseph could. Okay, an unlikely source. He's in the dungeon. Remember I forget which one, the cupbearer had forgotten about him. But when Pharaoh can find nobody to interpret the dream, Joseph is brought in. And Joseph says some of the very similar things that Daniel says here about, it's not me, I'm not the one who can do it, but God can, reveal mysteries, so on and so forth, okay? So, maybe there are other stories we can talk about as well, but let's stay with the Joseph story and the dream of Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 41. That's a nice thing to jot down in the margins if you're that kind of person. What added significance or what meaning might that connection bring to the story in Daniel chapter 2?
And that the people that are in a right relationship with God can give those answers because God has given it to them.
And has that changed over the long period of time between Joseph and Daniel? No, it hasn't, apparently. Okay? God is still the same God. Okay? What else would you say about the significance added to the story or in Daniel 2 because of the connection to Joseph and Pharaoh? Brian?
Well, Joseph and Daniel were both delivered by the dream. The power was given to them to interpret, and therefore their life was spared, or at least Joseph was released from prison, and Daniel, who was to be slain with the other wise men, was spared.
Saved from that fate. Okay? So personal deliverance as well as giving the interpretation to the monarch, right? Wendy, what do you think?
Delivering their people and getting their people delivered. Even though it was God that put them in the position, they were both had the attention of the ruler, and eventually that led to the delivery of the people.
Wendy says that it led to the delivery of the people. In Joseph's case, this is a little interesting. His people are delivered from what? Famine. Okay. In Daniel's case, he and his friends are delivered from the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar. But the idea of deliverance might also maybe remind us of something else. Okay, what might a reader think if you're connecting the story of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2 to Pharaoh in particular in Genesis 41? What was shortly going to occur to the people in Egypt under Pharaoh? Not the same Pharaoh, I know, but the next one. Yeah, slavery, right? Okay. And I wonder if the similarity of this story to the story of Joseph and Pharaoh is just another way to remind us and underscore for us the situation of the Hebrews in exile, that this is another Egyptian slavery. It's another form of bondage, okay? And when they're delivered, not to get ahead of ourselves here, when they're delivered and released to go back to Judah at the end of the 70 years of captivity, it's very much talked about as a second Exodus. It's another Exodus. They're going to leave with gifts from their captors and go back, very similar to the way that the people left Egypt the first time. But that's, the deliverance being a second Exodus can really only be a true connection if their captivity is seen as a second Egyptian bondage, right? If that makes sense. Okay? So the connection to Pharaoh, I think, maybe tightens that up a little bit. Brian?
Well, I might add that the dreams were not idle dreams, like a Samson given a riddle. I mean, this was a portent of what was going to happen in the future with Daniel. He's talking about the rise and fall of kingdoms. And with Joseph, of course, I guess you could, I'd have to tie that in. I have to think about it a little bit more, but in any event, it resulted in the rise of the Hebrew nation. And of course, the ultimate conclusion to the dream is that the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. And there's something else I'd add in here. Oh, and both were signs of the true God.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and both world leaders are kind of confronted with this truth about God that they have to reckon with on some level. Okay, so let's keep going. I said real quick. Other stories you thought of? We're not going to do the same kind of level of thoroughness with the other stories, but other stories that came to mind in Daniel 2. Moses. Yeah, any of these stories where somebody is standing in the court of a king and is put to some test, or there's some challenge put before them. Others.
I'm just wondering whether you can connect this at all to Joel. That he'll pour out his Holy Spirit, and your old men will dream dreams, and your young men will have visions.
Yeah.
Something along those lines.
Yeah. So Daniel is famous for being able to interpret dreams, and like Joseph, and obviously that is a special gift that he's given. But when Joel says that God's people, young and old, will see visions and dream dreams and everything, could be a hint that while not having the particular abilities that Daniel or Joseph had, there is this sense in which God's people are those who they understand. They see the world as it's supposed to be. They have a clear vision because God's revealed it to them. And we see more clearly than the rest of the world because of God's revelation. Something like that. I don't know. Take it or leave it. Okay, so we're set the stage here. We see Nebuchadnezzar. By the way, we just, in the homework, it asked to kind of think about Nebuchadnezzar's actions, right? And you definitely see some Pharaoh-like tyranny here, where he demands that they tell him the dream, right? Which not even Pharaoh went that far. Tell me the dream. How am I supposed to tell you what dream you had? Okay, and then the interpretation, and then the ruthlessness to kill anybody and burn your house down, right? If you don't tell me what dream I had, okay? So we kind of get us a glimpse of Nebuchadnezzar's character. We see the challenge. We see Daniel rising to the challenge. But let's look at,
On that Daniel rising to the challenge, he wasn't in line to be killed. They were going to actually be told to kill the false teacher.
It says he was going to be killed in verse 13. They sought Daniel and his companions to kill them because he was...
To kill, okay. I thought they were saying Daniel and them were going to kill.
chosen to be the executioners. Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think it's they're going to be killed along, because they're in chapter 1. They're in that whole group of people. That's the the wise and the trained and the intelligent, and so they get lumped in with all those that are going to be killed. Yeah, that's right.
Do you get it that Nebuchadnezzar really didn't know what his dream was? Or was this part of the test?
You're trying to. So, yeah, I guess I've heard that before. Nebuchadnezzar maybe just couldn't remember, right?
When you read it, you kind of think
Yeah.
he really couldn't remember. Some others
Yeah. I assume he knew what it was, and this was just his way of, put him to the test, Okay, any other questions? Okay. So let's go back, and we skipped over this point here. So we skipped over the in-between, right? We talked to where Daniel said, hold on, wait a second, and then where he went into before the king and began his answer. But in the meantime, this is what happens. When Daniel hears about the challenge. In verse 17, it says, Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. Therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went in and said thus to him, Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Okay. I know there are more than two things that Daniel says about God here, but this is kind of a key section. This is fairly common in these stories, where at some point in the story, a character will kind of stop and just make a declaration about God. Daniel makes a declaration about God here once the mystery is revealed to him. And what do you see are the big things that Daniel says about God?
Wisdom and power belong to him.
Wisdom and power belong to him. What do you see? He reveals secrets and mysteries. He reveals the hidden things. And he sets down, he removes, he brings down, sets up rulers. I'm going to identify those as the two main things, and everything else I think kind of fits into that here. Okay, so if you're looking for the main 2 points, the main 2 things that the story of Daniel chapter 2 is trying to get across. Again, it's nice and easy. Look at the place where someone says, here's why God is so great. He removes and sets up kings, okay? And he gives and he reveals the hidden things. Okay, the removal of kings and setting up of kings is, of course, a reference to the vision that's going to be explained, and the revealing of the hidden things is a reference to just how this is all playing out here. That God has revealed to Daniel the hidden things. Okay, he knows what's in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. Okay. But especially the removal and setting up of kings, that's what we want to be thinking about and emphasizing as we look at the vision itself. But before we do that, any other comments or questions through what we've read so far? Yeah, thank you, Dan. That fits in with what he told Nebuchadnezzar, right? I can't do this. No one can do this. It's only because God revealed it. Do I have the answer for you? Brian?
I always like the minutia that is consistent. It says there in 22, the light dwells with him. And of course, we know God declares himself to be light and Jesus to be the light of men.
Yeah.
And he says here also that thou hast given me wisdom and power. So God being all powerful and all wisdom, we know that the source of the power and wisdom that we receive comes from God as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Things are dark, like the future is dark to all mankind. God is light. He dwells in that light and sees all that will come ahead of time. Okay. Well, let's get into the vision here and read in 31 to 45, Daniel chapter 2, almost the rest of the chapter. But now that Daniel's had it revealed to him, he has gone before the king and said, this is what God's trying to tell you about what will happen in the latter days because he revealed it to me. Daniel continues in verse 31. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Verse 36, this was the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation. You, O king, King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, making you rule over all of them, you are the head of gold. Another kingdom, inferior to you, shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things, and like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation sure. Okay, so one of the nice things about the book of Daniel, and we'll continue to see this and explain more as we go, is that there's multiple visions that kind of talk about the same kingdoms that are coming down the pike. So we get an opportunity, for instance, in chapter 7, to review all this again, and in chapter 8, some of these kingdoms are even mentioned by name, which helps us know the interpretation because God tells us who they are. But if you see all the visions as matching up, that means chapter 2 is the same kingdoms as chapter 7. Chapter 7 is the same kingdoms, or at least some of them, in chapter 8. You can kind of put these together and avoid some of the, not as good interpretations of these stories. So, head of gold is Babylon. By the way, anybody surprised to see the description that Daniel gave Nebuchadnezzar? A little over the top, huh? King of kings. God has given him the kingdom, the power, the might, the glory, all of that. Nebuchadnezzar was a king of kings in the sense that he was king over, he had conquered many rulers. They were king under him, okay? Which is obviously the sense in which God is the ultimate king of kings. All authority is under him. He is the king of kings. And Nebuchadnezzar holds that authority to some degree as well, and has been blessed by who? By God, to have all of this power and all authority, okay? Then there is a chest of silver. Daniel says this is going to be an inferior kingdom. That really is intriguing to me. I'm always curious what the standard of evaluation is. In what sense did Daniel or God mean that Persia was an inferior kingdom to Babylon? Is that in human terms of might and strength and number and size, or is it some other way inferior? We'll never know, I guess. And does he mean that the next kingdom, the kingdom of Greece, will be further inferior? I think the Greeks were pretty great. I mean, they gave us Plato and Aristotle and Alexander the Great, and, pretty cool things. Democracy, maybe they're one step below Persia for some reason or another. Again, if you jot down, that might be helpful, but in Daniel chapter 8, these two kingdoms are seen in different form, in animal form, but they are seen as the next two kingdoms coming after Babylon, and they are named as the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greeks. Okay, so you say, well, how do we know that it's Persia and Greece? Well, chapter 8 tells us that Persia comes along after Babylon, and Greece comes along after Persia. Okay, the name that's not given to us, but in the next kingdom in the order of world history would be the Roman Empire, which is the legs of iron, even down into the feet. Okay, now we don't have to spend forever on this, but any Google search of this chapter of the statue or the book of Daniel in general, there are lots of theories that try to say that below the legs is some kind of future kingdom. And they take the iron and the clay mix to be, this is future kingdoms coming even farther down the road, like the European Union. That's not a joke. That's like a real theory, right? That down the road in human history, towards a modern day, there's going to be these conglomerations of nations or kingdoms. And that's what the vision is of the feet of iron and clay. And the reason that people want to do that is because they think the stone of the kingdom is going to be Jesus coming to set up, an earthly kingdom of some sort. And so that hasn't happened yet, right? So in order to make that work, you have to kind of keep stretching out the nations and the statues to make it come to modern day so that the vision will work. But that's not what the vision is saying, okay? When the stone comes and crushes the feet and the whole statue, what event is that referring to? The kingdom of God. What? Yeah, it's when Christ comes and establishes his kingdom. Okay? What happens when it hits the statue? Breaks everything in pieces. This isn't in the interpretation, but in the vision, I love it. It says, verse 35, not a trace, right? The statue will become like the chaff of the summer threshing floor. The wind carried them away. Not a trace of them could be found. Not a trace of the kingdoms of earth are left or found, because the kingdom of God has shattered them to pieces and filled the whole earth. Okay? All right. We are right on time. I bet you don't even believe that. But let's talk about the vision. I want to hear from you. So what are the lessons to be learned? We'll go through 3 groups that may need to learn some lessons here. What's the lesson for Nebuchadnezzar intended? In fact, I think I want to go ahead and read the rest of this. Daniel 2:46, and then we'll talk. The king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel, commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly, your God is a God of gods and Lord of kings, right? He's the real God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries. For you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts. Sounds like Joseph. Made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king. He appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. Okay, so what lesson does Nebuchadnezzar learn? Maybe we want to talk about what lesson should Nebuchadnezzar have learned from his dream and its interpretation. Brian, kick us off here.
Well, he learned that, I don't know that he remained faithful in a sense, but he recognized that the God of Daniel was the one and true and only God and the powerful God. And also he should have learned that his kingdom would not survive.
Should have learned about the all-powerful God and about his the temporary nature of his own kingdom. Okay? What else would you say about what Nebuchadnezzar should have learned or could have learned? Michael?
That God gave him what he has, his kingdom.
God gave it to him. Thank you, Michael. What else would you say about lessons for Nebuchadnezzar from the dream and its interpretation? Power and a plan. Okay? And Nebuchadnezzar is a part of that plan. He's just a part. And I don't know, in my mind I'm seeing both putting all this together that we've said, I'm seeing somewhat of an order here. Okay, it starts with a recognition of God as all-powerful. Then a recognition that God has this plan for the kingdoms of the earth. That Nebuchadnezzar has been blessed to be a part of the plan. And his power and rule and all that has been given to him by God. That's a blessing. That's a wonderful thing. But he's just part of the plan. His rule is temporary. Things will continue after him. Right? This is what he could have learned. What would you say about the Hebrews? Daniel, those that Daniel would have relayed the story to, those reading this story in Babylonian exile, what lessons would there be for them? Michael, what do you think?
God is still with us, with the people. He's with Daniel, who's remained faithful. I don't know.
So yeah, God. So you're even just from the larger story itself about the way Daniel is taken care of, right? God is with His people. John, and then we'll come back up to Brian.
Oh, I think maybe that nothing is permanent. This situation feels so overbearing, and maybe it looks like there's never a way out for me or my children or my grandchildren, but nothing's going to stick around forever.
Yeah. And you're right, that is a comforting message when things aren't going too great, right? This isn't forever. And obviously for the Hebrews, they were either already in, if you were with Daniel and his wave, or about to be in a pretty bad situation in exile. But it's not going to last forever. Brian, thoughts on the Hebrews in exile?
Yeah, I don't know that I can add much more to it, except it seems to me that the king was a quick learner, but he didn't retain it. But he should recognize, number one, the all-powerful God of the Hebrews, and that the Hebrew people were protected by God, and they were protected by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar himself, although he made statutes that resulted in punishing an attempted punishment of Daniel and his friends. But ultimately he trusted in himself, and that resulted in the next dream that he had and consequences of him going crazy.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Brian. And man, what a thought. So John says they would have seen nothing lasts forever. That's a comfort if you're being oppressed. But Brian mentions the idea of man, if you say take pride in this is our God. I mean, the God that's being described here, that is the God of kings, that rules over everything, that sets up and removes. That's our God. That's the God that has a covenant relationship with us. Okay, man, what pride you take again in God, and what comfort that is to say that God stands with us, His people. Okay, and then what would you say? Oh, one more thing on that, Michael.
I think it would be also encouraging to see one of your people get elevated to the position where Daniel was. That would be of comfort, I think, to, it would make you feel like, okay, well, someone on my side you've been given power.
Yeah. Well, and back to what Wendy said about the Joseph story. Remember, Joseph's elevation allowed him to use that power and authority to take care of God's people. And so, yeah, similar maybe comfort in the fact that now one of God's people is in a similar position of power. God's looking out for us, you might say. Okay. Brian, last word on that, then we'll move on to talk about us.
Well, one thing, I can go to the New Covenant, and I can't remember the verse citation, but all governments exist by the hand of God. Therefore, we're to pray for leaders and so forth. And what we learn from Ezekiel is God is sovereign over all nations. He raises them up, and He punishes them, and He tears them down. And so Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian regime and nation existed because God raised them up, and then God destroyed them. And it seems to me there's a life cycle to every nation on the face of this earth, and we're in one.
Yeah, so Brian refers to, among other passages, Romans 13. Now that Brian's jumped ahead to here, which I wanted to do anyway, thank you, Brian, to the last question here, what about us? What do we learn from this? Romans 13, that God has established instituted these authorities, okay? He sets up and He removes kings. Okay? Other things you would say about what we need to learn, Christians in 2022, what we take from the story in Daniel chapter 2 and the vision of Nebuchadnezzar. Albert, what do you think?
Covenant is still in place, the promises there, so with excitement, but also with trembling, we need to realize that God will carry through of His promises as well as judgment. So it should bring much celebration, but also fear. And then how those of this world who played upon the magicians and all those folks. They were exposed eventually in time, and then truth came out. So it's small point number 4 on page 4, but how they were called out and how the king was able to see that there is false teaching and God will handle accordingly. And we need to be wary and leery of that as well.
Okay. Thank you, Albert. Other thoughts about what we take from this story for ourselves? Granny says it's scary because of the way our nation is going, okay? I don't know, in this room we may have different opinions on the way our nation is going. But does it really matter which way our nation is going? What's true of any nation, no matter where it's going? Wait. It's all going the same place, right? It's all going into the trash heap of history. Regardless of whether we like the direction or not, that's my point. But you're exactly right. That's a sobering reminder of we actually know where this is all headed. Brian used the word life cycle earlier, right? And we're in the midst of that as well.
I think have different words for saying the same thing, but life and what's happening in the world with wars and all kinds of things happening in politics, it gets very chaotic and very discouraging, and we just have to understand that God is in control of everything. And if we're slated for destruction as a nation, then we will be destroyed, just like Babylon was, just like Jerusalem and Judah was. But, God takes care of the faithful remnant.
Amen. Thank you, Brian. Ian, something like that?
Yeah, I would say that, I guess, based on my understanding, every nation in all of existence has rejected God at some point, and we've seen every nation fall. So I think it's inevitable that every nation will fall under the cornerstone of Jesus, who founded the everlasting kingdom. It's just a cycle that's been repeated through history. So putting any trust in our physical kingdom is completely fruitless. We need to put our trust in our cornerstone, the foundation of the true kingdom, which is Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Ian. And Ian says, the difference between putting our trust in our nation or putting our trust in God, amen to that. I think you could also just say, what are we worried about and concerned about? I mean, how much time do we spend fretting over and working towards and thinking about all the stuff about our nation and the direction it's going? We know what direction it's going, okay? It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, right? Trying to be so concerned, watching all the news, reading all the articles, involved in all the activity, about a nation that we know is going to go the way of Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome, right? It's fruitless, futile efforts, as Ian points out. Instead, to attach ourselves, to apply ourselves to the rock. And obviously, as kingdom citizens, then we do good to all men, right? And we live as lights in our communities, okay? But that's different than getting all worked up and tied into the affairs of this nation that we know is just another one of the medals on the statue, right? I always wonder if the decrease in preciousness is supposed to continue throughout history. It's like, okay, by this point, what are we? Like cheap plastic, Yeah, little grain. Yeah, that's right. It just keeps getting worse and worse. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe we're like Teflon or something. We've really. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there you go. Okay, and then all of this, I think, this is really what the book of Daniel is just awesome for today. Awesome for any day, but awesome for our day especially because, look, these are the two main points of the book. Chapters 2 to 7, which we're in now, the point, chapter after chapter after chapter, is going to be God rules in the kingdoms of man. He sets up, he removes. He's in charge of all nations and leaders and so on, okay? That's the point of the first, not the first, but this first big chunk of Daniel. And then the second part of the book, in those visions, the point is that in the midst of all this chaos and the beasts that are the kingdoms of man, God's looking out for his people, and he has a plan. We're already seeing that to some degree. There is that stone that represents God's kingdom. And so God's people will be taken care of. We will be preserved through all of this as the world crumbles around us. Okay, but in this section here, and your Bible may have had a note, and I know we're going up towards the end here, but it's kind of interesting. We say that chapter 2 to 7 is all in Aramaic, which is it changes languages from chapter 1. The Hebrew is the language of the people of Israel. Aramaic is a more universal language. It's interesting, in the story, in verse 4, it says that the Chaldeans said to the king. So when they respond to the king, "O king, live forever," it says they respond in Aramaic, and it's like from that point forward, the text is in Aramaic until the end of chapter 7, where we go back to Hebrew. Okay, so it's like you're watching a movie and you hear someone start speaking, and they start speaking in a different language, and then the movie just stays in that language. You're kind of immersed in that new reality. But this is intended to be a more universally understood section of the book of Daniel, and you can understand why if the point is that God rules over whatever king you are, whatever kingdom you're a part of. Okay? So this story in Daniel chapter 2 is going to be bookended by another story of 4 kingdoms that are successively risen up out of the sea and then done away with by the eternal kingdom ruled over by the Son of Man. And then, as we'll see next week, chapter 3 will match up with Daniel chapter 6, and then 4 and 5 go together to create this nice symmetrical order of this section of the book. All right, the next handout is on the website if you want to do your pre-class assignment for next Wednesday when we get into chapter 3. Thank you, everybody.